Welcome, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. This session is Nuclear Risks and the New AI Arms Race. And we're very lucky to be joined by not one, but two extremely qualified speakers here to take us through this very exciting issue. To start, Alice Saltini is a policy fellow for the European Leadership Network, where she leads projects that explore the intersection of AI and nuclear weapons. Alice has published extensive research and reports on military applications of AI and developed a general-purpose risk assessment framework for analyzing AI and nuclear risks. Her insights have found a platform in a number of multilateral fora, including the NPT, the UK Parliament, the Creating an Environment for Nuclear Disarmament, CEND, the European External Action Service, and NATO. Also joining us is Beatrice Fihn. Beatrice was the executive director of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, or ICAN, from 2014 to 2023. If that acronym sounds familiar, it might be because Beatrice, in 2017, accepted a Nobel Peace Prize awarded to ICAN for their work to draw attention to the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of any use of nuclear weapons. Currently, Beatrice is director of Lex International, a philanthropic fund focused on supporting international law and global norms as a way to tackle global challenges. So in just a moment, we'll welcome both Beatrice and Alice on stage. We'll have a sort of two-part conversation where we talk first about the problem as it currently exists and then the way forward. And then after that, there'll be a Q&A. So I encourage you right now to go ahead and open Swap Card. You can navigate to the live discussion tab. And as you think of questions during the initial conversation, go ahead and write them there and also upvote other people's questions as they appear. And then during the Q&A portion, I'll make sure to ask the ones that people are most curious about first. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Alice and Beatrice. All right. Thank you guys again so much for being here.
Thank you.
So you've both prepared some opening remarks just to help us sketch the state of the problem as it currently is. Maybe Beatrice, we can start with you. Take us through how you see the landscape right now in terms of this era of increasing nuclear risk.
Yeah, thank you so much. First, it's really, really great to be here. This is my first EA conference, and it's just so nice to see so many people eager to solve problems. We need that today. When I started working on nuclear weapons issues about 15 years ago, a lot of people were like, nuclear weapons, do they still exist? Like, it's not really the most pressing issue, is it? Many, including the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, the UN Secretary General, many experts and others, have stated that the risks of nuclear weapons use is just as high, maybe higher than at the heights of the Cold War. So I was thinking I would start a little bit with outlining why we're in such a dangerous moment and sort of how we got here. I think one of the reasons why it's incredibly dangerous now, and maybe even more dangerous than during the heights of the Cold War, is the world is really much more complex and fast-moving than ever. During the Cold War, we had like two blocks, really, and they were sort of locked into a fight or into sort of tension, but they could also meet and discuss things. And we don't really have that in that way anymore. We have many more different states that are involved. It's much more complex. We have regional situations that suddenly very quickly gets global implications. We have private actors, like companies, that sometimes have more power and more influence to change these things than governments have. So it creates really fast-moving, unpredictable situations. And fast and unpredictable is quite dangerous when it comes to nuclear weapons. And given that the world is unlikely to become less complex, slower, and less messy, it really makes a lot of sense to get rid of nuclear weapons, to make sure that. So yeah, we're going to have to get rid of nuclear weapons. It's quite simple, actually. It's basically just maths. Whether the probability of use is high or low, it will always be greater than 0. So given enough time, the likelihood is that it will happen. Nuclear weapons will be used at some point, if we keep them forever. And a lot of people always ask me, like, do you actually think that we can get rid of nuclear weapons? We absolutely will get rid of nuclear weapons. The question is, though, will we do it before or after they're used again? And that's the real question we have to ask ourselves. So why haven't we done it yet? Well, first, I think we have missed opportunities. Missed opportunities in 1944, for example, which I'll come back to later, like as how we're having an Oppenheimer moment on autonomous weapons, a little bit like that. We are actually in almost like 1944, but for AI weapons right now. But we also missed it in the 80s, at the end of the Cold War, when the Cold War ended. We had in the 1980s huge public pressure for nuclear armed states to disarm. The nuclear freeze movement, if you don't know about it, is a huge, so one of the biggest social movements that we've seen in the world, and really managed to shift opinions and pressure for nuclear disarmament. At the Reykjavik summit in the 80s with Gorbachev and Reagan, they agreed to disarm, and I think 80% of the warheads will come down since then. But we really did miss a chance when the Cold War ended to go all the way. Actually, in Reykjavik, Gorbachev offered complete nuclear disarmament, and Reagan said no. And it makes me think, today, when we look at Russia, obviously we don't know what would happen, a lot of things will change, you can never predict what will have changed, but it's worth thinking that perhaps that was a mistake. So after the Cold War ended, we really took our eyes off the ball when it came to nuclear weapons. And we kind of stopped caring because we thought that that way of tension between superpowers, between blocs, it was no longer needed. But the weapons kept staying. So people stopped paying attention, but the weapons were still there. So it was really a missed opportunity. And sometimes when people say today, like, Beatrice, don't be silly, the conditions are just not right, we can't do it right now. Well, you didn't do that either when it was good times. We had moments where we had much, much better conditions, and we failed to do it. So basically, what was it going to take? We're going to have to do it anyway. One of the second thing that I think that has happened is that we continuously over-rely on nuclear deterrence theory. And it's worth remembering that nuclear deterrence theory was actually not invented at the same time as nuclear weapons were invented. It came much later, decades afterwards. Kind of when they realized that these were really unpractical and you can't use them, they needed to come up with another reason to keep them and keep investing in them. The idea that nuclear deterrence, it's inherently illogical and irrational, actually, when you think about it. We fully rely our security on what our enemy is thinking. It just seems incredibly risky and unpredictable. And there's no real scenario in warfare where it's actually more advantageous for your security to use nuclear weapons than to use other means, meaning that it's actually quite illogical. The third reason I think that it hasn't happened yet, we haven't gotten into nuclear disarmament yet, is really that nuclear weapons continues to be seen as valuable and prestigeful. It's a really brilliant marketing scheme, if you think of it. They're almost described as a massive technological achievement, like it's like, really, a high-level sort of thing that's happening. When it's quite outdated technology from the 1940s. It's incredibly clumsy. It's just a massive, big explosion that creates a havoc and spreads radiation. There's no finesse. It's not really the way that the military is actually developed in the 1940s. Then to high precision, super specific things, high tech. And we have this idea that nuclear weapons are almost like magic. They have all this magic power of just shifting the mindset of our enemy, like when they're actually just real weapons. I see it sometimes a little bit like religion. People like inherently just believe in some mythical characteristics around these weapons. And that's, of course, because there's an invested interest of some to keep it that way. From the governments that have them, they've invested a huge amount of money. And they're quite useless. They have to, promote something that these are magic or something like that. It's also very lucrative for the companies that are making them. It's huge contracts, massive amount of money being spent on nuclear weapons every year. And it just becomes renewed every year, meaning that's easy cash grab from a lot of weapons companies. And these companies also actually invest a lot in think tanks, PR efforts, sponsorships, to continue to legitimize nuclear deterrence strategies and the narratives around nuclear weapons that they're useful and important, and actually work directly to discredit disarmament efforts and international law and multilateralism. Very similar to the way that the oil industry has worked to undermine climate research, for example, and advocacy, or how the tobacco industry has worked to undermine sort of efforts to stop smoking. So that's kind of why I think we are here. I mean, there's obviously many other reasons as well, but trying to outline some of the key things that I think has ended up here in this moment.
Wow, thank you.
Happy talk. We'll get into the positive stuff later.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you came to a talk on nuclear risk expecting nothing but positivity, maybe you might be in the wrong place. But that's so helpful. I mean, it's not surprising in hindsight to hear that the military-industrial complex is involved in these things the way that so often commercial incentives interfere with public policy issues. But I think it's not something that immediately comes to mind when we think about something as grandiose as nuclear weapons. So thank you so much for the inside look at what's really going on there. Yeah, Alice, I wonder if you could expand a bit for us on this intersection of AI, this fast-growing threat, and how that factors into something that's been with us for decades now in nuclear risk.
Yes, of course. Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me here. It's such a pleasure to be here and talk to all of you. Well, Bea, of course, has already touched on that, but I think it's really important to actually drill down on the fact that the horrors of a nuclear war cannot really be understood easily. They really kind of break our comprehensions and become really what sounds like just a big number, but really escaping the harsh reality of what it would mean in terms of the cost of each human life and in terms of sheer suffering. Now, what we witnessed 80 years ago was absolutely devastating, and we'll be hearing from the survivors tomorrow on the nuclear bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But today, nukes are hundreds, and sometimes even 1,000 times more powerful than those that were used during World War II. And we have thousands of them. So in an all-out nuclear war, within hours, millions will perish, and within months, billions would follow suit, starving from nuclear famine, and really fundamentally ending human civilization as it is known today. So the risks of nuclear use today, either deliberately or by accident or miscalculation, as Bea said, is really at the highest since the Cold War. And so with current geopolitical competition, the ongoing modernization of nuclear arsenal, and the need to stay ahead of adversaries, technological innovation offers the prospect for a strategic advantage to nuclear weapon states. And so the states now are increasingly viewing AI as a tool that could help this, and its adaptation for nuclear decision-making is actively being considered. So now take really a second to let this sink in. Now, what countries are talking about is to bring together nuclear weapons and advanced AI systems. Now, this may sound like a science fiction plot such as Terminator or the 1983 movie War Games, but the scenarios at play are much less of a malevolent AGI in control of nuclear weapons, but it presents potentially like a much more nuanced and potentially immediate threat. And in fact, today's state-of-the-art could be placed in a situation where its reliability, where our survival could depend on its reliability. To anybody here in the room working on interpretability and alignment, how far are we from making this system safe? So, of course, when we talk about AI, we're referring to the latest wave of AI spurred by deep learning. Now, most states view AI as a strategic priority, as I said, due to the change in geopolitical environment and for the fear of potentially lagging behind competitors' technological innovation. So now this situation of a racing dynamic in the attempt to gain an advantage really presents a scary possibility that if nothing is done now, AI might be integrated before the full breadth of risks is fully categorized and even properly understood. So as most of you know, of course, there are large risks stemming from vulnerability and unreliability within today's current AI models. And so the main point of my argument really is, as of today, although states see AI as a tool that could, help decision makers to make potentially better informed and faster decisions, first thing, there is still a mixed bag of limitations and inherent risks that pose really grave risks to us. And secondly, we do not yet understand the full spectrum of their implications when it comes to nuclear decision making. And when we talk about nuclear decision making, really, we cannot afford any mistake. And so now to go a little bit into the meat of the subject, actually maybe not the meat for this audience, so we're still EA after all. so okay, let me rephrase it. To go deep into the subject, I'm drawing some of my remarks from a research project that at the ELN we conducted. It was supported by the US Department of State. And so basically, this project looked into breaking down the intersection of AI and nuclear decision-making from the point of view of the 5 nuclear weapon states recognized as such under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which, for those of you who don't know it, are the US, the UK, France, China, and Russia. And when I refer to nuclear decision-making systems, I refer to nuclear command, control, and communications, which is so-called NC3 systems, which very simply put, when I talk about NC3, we refer through the means through which the executive authority over nuclear decision is exercised and how the command and control of nuclear weapons is executed. Now, with that out of the way, let's jump back to our discussion. Now, risks are not just related to AI being in direct control of nuclear weapons. So although not all nuclear weapon states have explicitly committed to that, there doesn't seem to be much interest, luckily I should add, in a full and complete automation of nuclear decision-making systems. So this seems off the table for now, and again, luckily. Though the way the states seem to envision the role of AI is still far from without risks. So as of today, AI is viewed as something that can provide support to human decision makers by enabling them to make better informed and faster decisions. So the idea is that AI could play a crucial role pretty much in everything, in supporting from identification to drawing up battle plans, to evaluating courses of actions, to selecting targets and direct forces, and so forth and so on. But while these may not seem as concerning as a Terminator Skynet, it still has the possibility of very significantly increasing the risk of nuclear war, and especially if it is pursued quickly and without caution. So, but despite this implicit understanding, only 3 of the 5 nuclear weapon states, which are the UK, the US, and France, have explicitly committed to maintaining a human in the loop when it comes to nuclear decision-making. Now, what this really means, such as to what extent AI will be part of the decision process to have enough meaningful human control, is really still up for debate. So having framed this, let's go back a little bit to AI. So as we know, AI is increasingly gaining the ability to generalize across diverse tasks and to continuously improving as it's fed larger data set and more computational power. And this has achieved incredible and tremendous capabilities. But these very capabilities also present problems that are not resolved as of today. So we really can think about 4 categories of limitation when applying AI to sensitive, high-stakes military scenarios. Most of you, of course, will already know this, but just so we can recap it, everyone. So the first problem is really their unreliability, and particularly the proneness to hallucinations. Most of us actually experience this in different forms, I'm sure, ranging from a chatbot making up facts on historical events, or potentially a vision model seeing things that are not even there. And so in the context of NC3, this could mean hallucinating anything, or really kind of like an incoming attack, for instance. Well, the second issue, of course, is due to their interpretability. And just so we're on the same page, while we know the data that is being used to train AI, AI learns correlation without specific instructions by us. And so in practice, this means that as the technology stands, we don't really understand the underlying process used during inference to make a certain prediction. The interpretability people in the room, if we have any, please kind of excuse the lack of precision of my definition. But of course, this has really profound implications, especially in critical decision-making scenarios, where human operators basically have no way to directly either verify AI-generated recommendations or predictions under that time pressure. So a third issue is really linked to the susceptibility to cybersecurity threats, which can open up avenues for hackers to infiltrate and tamper with sensitive military data. And of course, these vulnerabilities provide obviously adversaries and non-state actors also with opportunities to compromise AI systems. And so, for example, by leading to failures to detect an enemy attack. And the last point really is that as these models develop and become more and more capable, we must ensure that they are aligned to our goals and values, which unfortunately today remains still a big challenge. But really, these risks can all change rapidly if the technology, as the technology and our understanding progresses of this. So let's try this to put this into perspective and see how nuclear escalation can arise as a result of this. So there are a number of ways that we can think about it, but for instance, escalation could arise due to technical failures, and so where specific AI failures could propagate throughout decision-making systems and lead to skewed decisions. Another way that we can think about it is for escalation to arise due to altered decision-making dynamics, where basically the integration of AI into decision-making systems can create dynamics where the AI produces recommendations that may not be proportionate or necessary, and particularly maybe when de-escalation is possible in that case. So, for instance, the system might recommend an escalatory course of action based perhaps even on the right pretense, but without sufficient considerations of less aggressive options. And so because of the limited amount of time available for decision makers, they might be tempted to follow the system's recommendations rather than considering other options. And finally, escalation may arise due to the interaction of humans with machines that could lead to automation or confirmation bias, whereas basically a human operator either overtrusts or mistrusts an AI system's output, and so leading to decision based solely on these feelings that the operator has over the system's recommendations. So, or the operator may allow the system's recommendation, may follow the system's recommendation only if they align with their worldview or preconceived intentions. So, for example, an operator that is more prone for escalation might act on these recommendations without necessarily questioning them. But to add insult to the injury, even if we apply AI to functions that are not formally into the not formally part of the NC3 architecture, such as for intelligence collection, for example, this still might inadvertently affect nuclear decisions because, of course, it would relate information to decision makers which might be incorrect or being tampered with, and so potentially leading to escalation under false premises. Though one thing is clear to me, and that is as long as we have nuclear weapons, as Bea said, there is a really high chance that given enough time, our luck will run out. Well, some might point out, I'm sure many have pointed out to you probably, that, this hasn't happened in 80 years. But these timescales really are nothing. And using this point as much as giving evidence to the fact that, we haven't been hit by an asteroid, right? So nuclear weapons are really an existential threat right before our eyes. And it takes just one madman, one miscalculation, just one mistake. The stakes could not be higher. And any mistake could really lead to nuclear escalation. But in the absence of dialogue across relevant states, it only takes one state, only one, to prematurely integrate a technology in nuclear systems or in systems that fit into it that might lead to a catastrophe. And we really must seek to avoid that at all costs.
Absolutely. And boy, yeah, the stakes do seem especially high when you realize that there's no margin for error here, right? You could have 99% of the decision-making go right, and one mistake is the catastrophe that we're trying to avoid. So thank you for that level of detail and breaking down the problem. It's not just this Terminator scenario, as you say, and so it's good to get into the specifics. But now that we know how high the stakes are, where do we go from here?
What do we do about it?
Yeah, indeed. Let's try to get some optimism back in the room. Yeah, maybe you can start if you have some thoughts on the path forward.
Absolutely. Optimism is my real profession, to be honest. But I mean, I think it is very easy with these massive, big things to feel very hopeless, like things are impossible to change. And I'm going to cut this a little bit shorter because I want to make sure that we have time for questions as well. But I think it's important to remember that we have had a lot of successes. Sometimes people think about nuclear weapons like, well, there are still nuclear weapons, so everything has been hopeless and everything that's been done has been for nothing. That is absolutely not true. We've made have a lot of victories and a lot of achievements, and we've prevented nuclear war many times over. For example, we've been extremely successful in preventing new countries from developing nuclear weapons. It's actually really impressive to think about that only 9 states have them. And again, there's this kind of misconception that there's like, oh, it's so difficult to develop them. If North Korea can develop nuclear weapons, most countries can. They have chosen not to, right? They have chosen to ensure their security through other means. And I think that that's important to remember because sometimes we let the 9 countries dominate the whole conversations, and we forget that massive countries, like 5 of the biggest countries out of the 10 biggest countries in the world, are non-nuclear armed states, and 5 are nuclear armed states. So it's important to remember that. I think also we've ended nuclear testing. That is also not to be taken for granted. There was a lot of work and a lot of civil society activism, governments working on that to do that. We have prohibited and eliminated chemical and biological weapons. That's also massive achievements. And we have achieved a treaty that prohibits nuclear weapons that entered into force in 2021. I'll get back to that a little bit soon as well. So I think that we've had a lot of victories and a lot of achievements. And for those of you who will listen to the Hibakusha tomorrow, their work in also telling the stories from Hiroshima and Nagasaki has been invaluable in also raising the norm against use of nuclear weapons. I usually say that these are the people who have actually saved the world several times because they keep reliving the most traumatic memories to protect people from experiencing the same as them. And because of their stories and because of their work, we have managed to make it really unacceptable to use nuclear weapons. And that's not to be taken for granted. That can also fall if we stop talking about those things. So when I talked about the problem, and one of the challenges is that the world is much more complex than ever, but that is also a huge opportunity. And right now, and I think that unprecedented in history, regular people have the opportunity to influence big geopolitical shifts. The way that we work, the way that we talk, the way companies operate, the way that things are moving right now, we have enormous, unprecedented power. And we should use that much more. So this kind of feeling that it's impossible to change, it actually is possible to change. We're seeing every day, and again, it's not fast enough. Governments, they're rubbish, most of them, sorry. But we are influencing and we are connecting with people across borders. We're working so much more global than we've never ever done before. And things that are happening on the other side of the world has ripple effects and triggers actions. Students in the United States saw what's happening in Gaza, mobilized there. They mobilized in Switzerland, in universities, mobilized everywhere. We have unprecedented powers and opportunities right now, and I think we need to use them on nuclear weapons as well. I also think that really dangerous moments in the past, we have seen huge progress afterwards. After the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty was negotiated, which was the legal basis for preventing more countries from developing nuclear weapons. In the 80s, we had huge tension between Soviet and the United States, really, really close to nuclear war, and then that led to massive mobilization and the Reagan and Gorbachev summit when they negotiated huge reductions of nuclear arsenals. So right now we're in a very dangerous moment, and we can use this moment to actually, and this is a case to be made for doing that. So Really quickly, even though this is the most important part of everything, what do we do now? I mean, first, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons that ICAN has worked on to guard nuclear weapon states. A bunch of regular people, and we weren't even that many, managed to get over 100 governments to negotiate and adopt an international treaty that prohibits nuclear weapons. Now, it's only a first step, right? Because the nuclear armed states didn't join it yet. But it's also, the strategy is really to first develop the law, then develop the norm, and then shift behavior and achieve dismantlement of nuclear warheads in the end. So the law is now in place, and ICAN is working, and governments are working, and international organizations are working into turning this into a norm that shifts behavior. These kind of things take decades of time, but it's really important work. On the AI's arms race side, there's really encouraging developments happening on autonomous weapons, like AI weapons, where there is starting to become momentum for our new treaty, prohibited fully autonomous weapons that have no meaningful human control, and regulating AI on how we can use AI in warfare. And I think this is, again, extremely important. I think that one of my frustrations sometimes with this sort of AI safety conversation is that we tend to not talk about the weapon side. And for me, that's the first red line in the sand. If we're worried about AI, how are we not talking about the weapon side and AI weapons? We should not we're worried about how it will impact artists and musicians and actors. But first, let's make sure they don't kill us. Literally, it's the first line in the sand that we need to draw. And it's actually happening. It's being a process. There was a big conference in Vienna a few weeks ago. Governments are mobilizing. Might be a vote at the UN to take the next step towards these negotiations. And it's been very clear that by 2026, this new treaty should be in place for many states. So that's an incredibly encouraging thing. And love to talk to more to people after. And I think we're going to have office hours afterwards as well, if you want to come and talk more specifics about that.
Great. Well, some really concrete ideas already. Thank you. Alice, anything to add in terms of?
Yeah, sorry, I'm gonna cut it short too. But so given the high stakes of nuclear decision making, and based on everything that I said before, what we need to do right now, as soon as possible, actually, is at the very minimum establishing thresholds for high-risk integration. To do that, we really need to make greater efforts on risk assessment. So we need to develop a little bit more research on exactly how to categorize these risks to identify really high-risk integration, which is exactly what's going to help us to establish thresholds for integration. At least this threshold would have the goal to ensure that any failure of AI will never and must never lead to miscalculation or increase the risk for catastrophic outcomes. So that's really kind of the bare minimum. This stuff is really kind of necessary to grapple with the complexity of assessing the implications of the integration of AI in specific functions of nuclear decision making. But just to put it into perspective, just to give a little bit of example, it is obvious that as a current state-of-the-art model that can perform a wide variety of tasks and is highly performing, but at the same time is black box or prone to hallucinations, very obviously, is not fit for integration in strategic decision-making functions within NC3 systems. Well, that's obvious. But also this doesn't mean, for example, that it would be risky if we integrated for force training or in simulations. On the other hand, you see a black box vision model that doesn't have enough verification or redundancy or has vulnerabilities to hallucinations and cyber threat, still provides a high level of risks if we integrate it in systems that relate to intelligence collection, for example, or in early warning systems. So these examples are just really to underline how this issue is really not black and box and how it is necessary that we do more research towards fine-graining these risks in order to establish thresholds. So this is really kind of a practical solution that we can and should already start working on and can be used as a basis for developing agreements and understandings to work amongst nuclear weapon states on where we can draw thresholds. So though there is so much more that needs to be done, we need to explore first present risks, but also future risks, depending on AI, on how AI develops. And so what would the implications be of AI for training AI with human or superhuman level intelligence on military tasks? How will this impact the risks of nuclear escalation? So I really think that we need new solutions. Nuclear war needs to be seen as a priority again. We can't continue sweeping it under the rug and just ignoring it. We just can't do it. It has faded away from our collective perspective. It really just doesn't help. And noble efforts such as the TPNW and the initiatives that Bea brought up really play a crucial role. But we also need more to that. We need engagement with nuclear weapon states. We need to build trust between them, and we need to lay the groundwork for disarmament. And we must do whatever we can, really, to reduce the risk of a nuclear escalation at the very minimum in the interim. But we can also make progress. Just this month, for example, I've spoken with a number of governments and made headways with CEND, which is an initiative that stands for Creating an Environment for Nuclear Disarmament, which is basically a group of diplomats from many countries that discuss exactly about this issue, creating the environment for disarmament, and includes a list for the 5 nuclear weapon states. And they are receptive, at least some of them, they are receptive to the idea of limiting AI and nuclear integration. I also just yesterday spoke to the European External Action Service, which is the diplomatic body of the EU, explicitly on this issue. And later this month, I'll be speaking also to another conference at the German Foreign Office and at NATO. So we need to work with governments and we need to speak to decision makers. But this is really just the beginning. But we need greater focus on building practical solutions and working with stakeholders. Like, we need to engage in a guerrilla diplomacy, as my boss Adam likes to say. Like, we need this generation and the next generation to see the risks that are posed by nuclear war, and we need to see them. They need to see this in the same light that AI and climate change is seen. Like, nuclear issues, there's no other way of putting it, really. Nuclear issues have fallen out of the spotlight and are viewed as yesterday's problem. But they are very much today's and tomorrow's risks until we achieve disarmament, or at least meaningful progress towards it. So these issues are woefully, woefully underfunded. And in the shadow of actually other risks of today, and despite their intersection. And so with such a lack of funding, there are of course hard limits on what we can achieve. Like, nuclear issues and their intersection with AI need to be a funding priority. And really, we need more people to focus on these issues. We need institutions, we need treaties, as Bea said. It really just takes only one mistake, one simple miscalculation that really could be made tomorrow. Like, really. Especially if we really blind race to one-up one another and integrate this technology that we really don't understand yet. So we have current risks that exist right in this moment, and that could kill within hours millions of people, and at least hundreds of millions, hundreds of thousands to millions of people. And with more time, they could kill billions, and really extinguishing the light of human civilization as is. So, and as effective altruists, as worried citizens, but most of all as human beings, we owe it to ourselves, really, to do everything possible to avoid our annihilation and to focus on building a better future with less risks. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, so well said. We have a few minutes for questions from the audience, so thank you so much to everyone who's already submitted. As a reminder, if you have something that you're curious to ask Bea or Alice, just go ahead and do so on Swapcard, and you can upvote the questions that are already there as well. Yeah, there's actually a common theme already emerging with some questions from people like Jordan and Corin in the audience who are wondering, deterrence seems like the ultimate goal here is not a world where deterrence holds, but a world where we've disarmed completely, right? If we achieve that, what's to stop us from regressing at some point? I mean, once we've invented the technology, we're not going to lose track of the fact that this is possible. And so it sort of seems like the incentives are going to be there for this to emerge at some point. And Amar even brings the idea one step further in saying, if we have a system where only a bad actor in violation of some international norm is the person who's willing to bring weapons to the fore. Maybe that's sort of worse than resetting to zero, because now we've incentivized only the worst actors to have these most powerful weapons. So can you talk a bit about why disarmament is the goal and why that is a feasible and permanent solution?
Yeah, I mean, I hear a lot of this, the genie's out of the bottle, we have the technology, so it's a bit like silly, actually. There's a lot of technology that we developed that we then discarded because they wasn't actually fit for purpose, constantly. I mean, have you tried to charge your computer and it still doesn't work, the cables are wrong and things like that. We constantly update to more useful technologies. We're not missing a lack of ability to mass murder civilians. Like, that's what they're good for, right? The only characteristics of nuclear weapons that's unique is its ability to very quickly wipe out civilian populations. But we've also had other weapons that do that. Chemical weapons, biological weapons, for example, and we've discarded them. You can't really put the chemical weapons genie back in the bottle, but we don't see them as oh, Syria still has chemical weapons, therefore they rule the world. They have the ability, with serious chemical weapons, they would have had the ability to mass murder a lot of civilians with that. Doesn't mean that they get to call the shots. But with nuclear weapons, and this is what I talked about earlier, this kind of we ascribe it characteristics beyond what they actually have. We just see them as kind of magic. All it takes for deterrence to not work is for someone to say, nah, don't believe in it. That's all it takes, right? And isn't it extremely risky to put our entire security in the hands of Putin and be like, I think it's going to be rational. I think he's always going to do the right thing. I think that he's going to be more scared of killing, civilians than I am. I don't think that sounds like a very, rational idea. And again, I think you can also see at least 150 countries, I mean, it's about over 180 countries that don't have nuclear weapons, but at least 150 aren't even in a military alliance with a country with nuclear weapons. They, in Latin America, why are they not invading each other constantly? Why are they not? I mean, there are other things that deter. I'm not saying that deterrence might not work. Threats work sometimes. I just say that it might not always work. And it might be a lot of other things that means that we don't invade each other. And I think it's quite naive to think that there's this one unique little thing, nuclear weapons, that makes the difference. Why are, for example, Mexico and Brazil not going to war with each other? They don't have nuclear weapons. There are other reasons why we don't go to war. So there's a very complex system. And I think that the benefits of nuclear weapons are very, very overestimated. And there's a lot of other decisions that go into making that. So in a way, when people talk about how would a world without nuclear weapons, would it be more war? No, I don't think so. I think we have the ability to wage war in many different ways. We have the ability to inflict enormous amount of harm. The fire bombings of Tokyo was just as destructive as the bombings of Hiroshima. Of course, nuclear war with many, many nuclear weapons would create a nuclear winter. That's a very unique effect, of course, which is deeply illogical because that's suicide. So I think that there's a lot of assumptions on nuclear weapons that are we just say it, that they prevent world war, which is not really based on evidence.
Yeah, but I mean, it's so tricky because you don't have the counterfactual to examine of how the 20th century plays out without these weapons. But there are plenty of people in the field of sort of nuclear studies who disagree with you and would point to what you just said of nuclear winter being suicide.
But serious people will say, we don't know, right? You can't prove the absence of a world war is based on nuclear weapons. You can't disprove it either, right? It didn't happen. It's like saying I ate a red M&M every day and I didn't get cancer. That doesn't mean, I can't prove that. It's very difficult to prove the opposite too. So there's a lot of assumptions, right? And I think that that's the key, that we have to admit that we don't know if nuclear deterrence works.
Do you think there's hope to get more empirical clarity on that question? I'm curious if it feels like there's open fields of study here that can generate more consensus, or are we sort of just doomed to say, because we don't have a way of rerunning the tape on history, this is always going to be fundamentally uncertain?
As I said during my presentation, I just think, you can't, So it's like saying, okay, well, we have been having nuclear weapons for 80 years, and we haven't gone in a war for 80 years, right? Like a major war. Really, this, as I said before, like these timescales really are nothing. It's just like comparing it. Say, oh, we haven't been hit by an asteroid yet. I mean, high chances are, I believe that the longer we wait with this. With nuclear weapons, chances are that our luck will run out. I mean, we've had loads and plenty of examples and episodes where, there could have been chances for miscalculations. We've been lacking all along. Do we really want to continue in this way? That's really what I want to say.
Sure. Okay, we have some questions that are specifically about this intersection of AI and nuclear risks. I wonder if we could just fire off a couple rapidly. So one is, are there ways in which AI might actually be an improvement over the current system where, as we know, humans are quite fallible? Are there areas in which this actually can make a more reliable system if we involve both?
Yeah, certainly. I get this question quite often. I don't want to get just into the risk side. Really, the only thing that I want to say is that the way that I see it, the technology as of today, it's just not safe enough to be integrated. What this doesn't mean that couldn't be potentially beneficial, but that's really kind of the point of what I suggested in my recommendations, which is really we need to do more research into fine-graining these risks and implications specifically on each functions of nuclear decision-making. Because as I said, right, that doesn't necessarily mean that and also, it really depends on a lot of things. It depends on the model that people are considering for integration. It depends on the area of integration itself. It depends on, the human control over this function and, the level of redundancies as well. So there is really a lot of factors that play in. But even say, let's assume that, like a model, like of course, like a deep learning model that is prone to hallucinations, as I said. No, I don't think I said that. But like a model that is prone for hallucination, of course, it's just, obviously, it's not fit for strategic decision-making functions within NC3. But it could be potentially, not only not risky, but could be potentially be benefit for simulations or for training forces. So really what I'm saying is that it's really more complicated than just say it's black and white. I said it's not black and white. And to really give a good response to that, I'm afraid that I'm going to have to say we have to do a lot more research than that. And again, it just depends on so many other things. It's a research that me myself actually I'm interested in pursuing. But of course, it could be useful. I mean, countries see their strategic, like having a strategic advantage by having possibly better informed decisions. Obviously, they're assuming, that the AI will, in that case, for situational awareness, or if it's integrated for intelligence collection or for early warning systems, of course, they are assuming that it will do its work and it will do it well. But the reality of the situation is that this technology is still fallible. And if we're talking about nuclear decision making, we, at the very, very least, we want to make sure that the systems are absolutely perfect. Yeah.
But can I just add there, because I think we have a real life scenario. I don't know if you know Stanislav Petrov, the man who saved the world in the 1980s, a Soviet missileer who was in charge of authorizing or like putting up the decision chain, the decisions to a counterattack of nuclear weapons. And he got on his monitors incoming missiles. And all the protocols that he was supposed to follow meant he was going to, start a chain of retaliation on American cities. And he just felt that it was off. There was something about it. It didn't make sense given the political, things that were happening. And the number, why would it be 11? Or I can't remember the number exactly, but it was a random number. Like, why would they fire 11 nuclear missiles? So he decided to disobey his protocol, right? Which is it's illegal for the military to do this. This is, he really took a massive personal risk on that. And he, has recalled afterwards that, in 30 minutes, I'll know if I'm right or wrong, right? And obviously he was right. It was some kind of solar flares on a satellite that had manipulated the radars. So these kind of things makes you wonder what an AI would have done. And also, given that it is quite illogical, like it's never in our advantage to start nuclear war. Do you tell the AI that? Because if you do, the AI will like, well, we'll never do it. So then the terrorist doesn't work, right? Because you know that it's not going to do it. Or do you tell the AI, no, actually it is in our interest? So I think that there's all these questions about how an AI would reason in these kind of things, because nuclear deterrence relies on disregarding common sense and disregarding what's in your interest. And how do you, you have to do that in order for nuclear deterrence to work. You have to disregard your own interest. And how would that work? I just think that there's a lot of questions, so I wouldn't trust it.
Well, if I can actually add something very, very quickly to that. Actually, it's something that I also mentioned in my presentation. The very minimum also that we can do is make sure that if we integrate this type of technology at this stage, we really have to make sure that they are aligned to our goals and values, right? That's exactly what you're saying. And that was my example on, like escalation that could happen by an AI not considering other courses of actions that are potentially de-escalatory. So that's really another thing, and we're far from making progress. I mean, progress, of course, it's happening, but we really have to make sure that the systems are properly aligned with us.
Yeah, lots of work yet to be done. That's definitely clear. So thank you guys both for being a part of that crucial work. That's all the time we have, unfortunately, now, but luckily, both of you have made even more of your time available for office hours after this in the Docklands room. So I encourage those of you, especially those whose questions we didn't get to show up for that and take advantage of our guests here today. Please, before we go there, join me one more time in thanking Alice and Beatrice.